Yep, no problem. Just did it.
All right, so welcome everybody. My name is James Gress. This is the Tampa Bay DevOps Meetup. We like to put this meetup together to kind of share what's going around from a DevOps perspective across Tampa Bay. Now that everyone's working from home, and we've kind of branched out and started doing this beyond just the Tampa Bay area. We're always looking and interested in if you want to speak and or tell us about your client experiences around DevOps, whether that's transformational, big, small, any specific topic, anything from Kubernetes to code quality to infrastructure as code. Happy to have you host here and kind of spread some of the things that we're doing around the community. Please be aware that we are recording this event and we will be posting that out to YouTube. Try to keep your phones on mute unless you're talking. Michael, I probably should ask this question, but is it okay to kind of interrupt in the middle? What's the best way to wait until the end, or are you going to put little breaks out there to ask questions, give a chance to ask a question? Or?
Yeah, I think both. If you want to interject at some point, that's fine by me. And then I usually will pause for breaks and ask people questions as well. And then if you want and you're doing something in conjunction with this, you can also pop a question in. I have the group chat up so I can see it if you want to ask a question there as well.
Perfect. And we do encourage video. It makes everything feel a little bit more socially engaging, not required though. Other than that, we'll get right to it. And I wanted to welcome Michael Frazier, co-founder, CEO, and chief architect of Refactor. He's also an Air Force veteran that used to work on F-15 fighter jets, which I'd love to talk at a different time about, but since this is more on the DevOps side, we'll focus on that. And Michael is also a thought leader in the DevSec area, and he's going to be talking about CI/CD pipelines for DevOps, DevSecOps in a hybrid cloud. So Michael, appreciate you coming on, and if you want to take it from here, that'd be great.
Awesome, appreciate that. And I would wager to say that the Air Force now, we're doing Kubernetes on F-16s, at least for an interesting little POC that they did last year, or it was the beginning of this year. So it's kind of weird to see the DevSecOps getting all the way to fighter aircraft, because that was the farthest thing that would ever happen when I was working on F-15. So yeah, it's pretty interesting where we're at in 2020. So just a little bit of background on me. I'm, as James said, an Air Force veteran. I worked on F-15 Cs and Ds when I was active duty, aircraft armament, which means I worked on weapon systems and helped load and troubleshoot all kinds of different missile systems. And then I was also in the Guard as a cybersecurity engineer as well. Currently, I'm co-founder and CEO of Refactor, and recently, kind of tying into my Air Force background, I used my GI Bill and got my Master's of Computer Science last year at Seattle University. And I'm also an adjunct instructor over at Seattle Central College on DevOps, security, cybersecurity, and cloud. And then interesting, just recently I presented at All Day DevOps Spring Break Edition, and my talk got picked up, and it's actually one of the chapters in the All Day DevOps Feedback Loops 2, Volume 2. And so there's a link at the very top of the chat. If you click on it, it's on the Sonatype page. You can go check that out. Ton of really good thought leaders in there, really good content. I'd recommend it. It's free to download. I've also spoke at all kinds of different events like Red Hat Ansible Fest, and also at the other event that James spearheads and is a part of founding the inaugural DevOps Days Tampa Bay. So that was amazing last year. Kind of disappointed I wasn't able to be there this year, due to COVID-19. But I'm definitely interested coming to Tampa next year. So we shall see what the future brings. So let's start out with where things are at from a standpoint of traditional IT. Really, when we look at traditional IT, everything is, hardware centric. And if I could have anybody that is not muted to mute, just because I'm getting some feedback. I'm going to just mute everybody that I see on that's not muted other than James. And then if you come back again, you can unmute yourself. All right. So traditional IT, hardware centric, very project based, very much about on-premise or a data center type of deployments. Everything is really done in increments. It's not done all at once, focusing a lot on network hardware and server desktop type of or server client type of architecture. So it's really not conducive to where things are currently in 2020 and where things are going as well. It's also why there, has been an issue with just deploying traditional IT in general, where you may procure something, you want to pre-configure it. It still requires multiple steps in the process, somebody to touch where and what you're doing inside of the process, getting it out to a data center or on site, finalizing the configuration. And so you can automate certain pieces and parts of this process, but it's really hard to have an end-to-end life cycle that you can automate because of the fact that hardware, not only is hardware in play, but you also have different steps in the process that you have to go through in order to get the end result of getting that piece of equipment installed and then in place, and then also how and what are you going to do to maintain that as well. And so a lot of the vendors out there in the space in general around cybersecurity or on-premise data center, so rack and stack servers and so on. A lot of the tools around that were made just to be able to update those tools. But how do you think about things more holistically as you're trying to build solutions, not just having point products or solutions? You're trying to do one thing and get it out there, and being able to understand that you really have to focus in on, like, what is the traditional IT process? How are things being done? And really, there's a lot of manual steps in the process that makes it very difficult for you to be able to update things, or when you're going to refresh hardware, it requires a complete procurement cycle, requires built-in obsolescence. So usually it's on a 5-year cycle, and then you're going to go back and refresh the hardware, and then everything is really about a capital expense in this type of scenario, not operationalizing it more into a subscription. So there's a lot of downfalls to a traditional IT type of approach, and really, when it comes down to that, it's traditional IT really is legacy. But it's still in place. And so because of the fact that we still have a lot of stuff on premise, we have to really understand that that's where we can hone in on everything being hybrid. And hybrid really is about embracing traditional IT and IT, and then also where we're going with things just generally around the terms you hear out there, like DevSecOps, being able to utilize CI/CD, what exactly and how do you approach implementations from a hybrid standpoint. And so one of the things that I saw out there, which I love this tweet, is that the overall OSI model is this is where we're trying to go with everything, where every single layer becomes software, and if it's software defined, we can now put it into a CI/CD type of pipeline, because of the fact that that's the approach that you can take. And now all of a sudden, the more of the legacy hardware centric type of approach can be done in an agile sort of process. So it's really key to understand that a lot of what we're trying to get to with DevSecOps and CI/CD pipelines, and even how that applies to hybrid cloud, is really comes back to that everything has to be software defined, or a term I've coined, which is IT as code. And so if we look at IT as code and what that is versus traditional IT, the real difference of this, and this all the way goes back to, you probably heard out there, calms, or different sorts of framework ideas around DevOps, is really looking at the mindset and the culture, how you're going to go about automating and creating things in a more of an agile process, looking at the tools that you can use, because a lot of the tools that you're going to use in an IT as code approach aren't going to be the same types of tools that you're going to use necessarily on traditional IT. But the goal is that you can figure out and look at, okay, if I'm approaching a hybrid environment, because almost every organization out there, unless you started in the last 5 or 6 years, is most likely in a hybrid approach to their IT. And so how do you look at deploying new solutions, and then also looking at tools and how they can apply both to traditional IT and anything that's software defined, or as I call it, IT as code, and get everything into an agile approach, because it all needs to be iterative. Everybody wants to speed up how they build solutions and update things from a security posture standpoint, being able to have stuff to be able to update really quickly if a security vulnerability comes out so you can patch something. Having everything in the same agile approach is essential. And so being able to have coverage on more of your legacy stuff with the tooling that can also apply to your public cloud or anything that you're trying to do that's software defined now gives you an ability to start thinking about this beyond software delivery, and more about a holistic mindset of how this applies to everything that you're doing from an IT standpoint, to include all of your infrastructure, all of your applications, all of your security. Everything that you do can be put into this approach. And if you can do that, then you're really honing in on a hybrid type of approach. And that's where you can start thinking about how to apply CI/CD pipelining, because that's taking the tooling one step further and really getting yourself into an automation process that everybody's wanting to have happen, from the DoD all the way down to to smaller startups. And so you have to first change the mindset and how you're approaching things. And one of the things that one of the shows that I'm a huge Trekkie, Star Trek fan, resistance is futile, prepare to be assimilated. It's really, thinking about, a lot of us here on this call are in DevOps and DevSecOps. I heard somebody, working on Platform 1 for the Air Force, which is awesome. But the real thing to all this is we can't stop the change that's happening now. We really have to embrace it and understand that there's no way that we're going to not also have to support legacy or traditional IT as well. And so we have to embrace the fact that there's this new wave of IT as code that's happening, but also in conjunction with that, we still have to support the existing systems that are out there. And so we need to know that, the change is here and we really have to embrace it. And so we need to think about, the hybrid approach to these things and how we're going to go about doing that. And then also, what does it mean to add in, or have a true DevSecOps approach to being able to change how, your organization approaches being able to make everything that you're doing internally agile, and mapping to what everybody calls, the term that I'm not a huge fan of, the digital transformation. But the core of that whole movement is about increasing the agility of the company and leveraging the technical side to be able to increase the agility of the business side. And so if you can do that and still support the legacy systems in conjunction with this movement towards software-defined IT as code, you're really going to not only be something out there that is different in approaching things in a way that you're able to embrace this overall modernization. I'll stop there for any questions, comments. Do I see anything? All right, cool. So the next thing kind of just to think about too is, IT as code itself, everything software defined requires DevSecOps. I view DevSecOps as being more holistic. We start with that, DevOps added agile infrastructure essentially to agile software development or software delivery. And so because of that, it really helped the dev and the ops team start working together and created a whole new group of individuals out there that we now call DevOps engineers or SREs. And so on top of that, we need to realize that DevSecOps added agile security and as code, which, everything's now software defined, to DevOps. So it's not AppSec just renamed. It's really a whole new approach to incorporating multiple teams together and adding in the security team and really just other teams in general into the mix, so that you may have a separate infrastructure team, a cloud team, you could consider them ops or just another team. But the overall goal of kind of understanding here is that everybody collectively is working together and they're a part of the same life cycle of any solution you're building. I saw, what is it, last year at Google Cloud Partner Summit at Google Next, they had a stat that was thrown out there, and it was super interesting because, you know, something I've been saying for a while, and it was good to see somebody like Google quantifying it, which was 80% of workloads as of April of last year, approximately 80% of workloads are still on premise, just generally out there. And those workloads really show that there's just still this major wave, even, you know, over a year later, of organizations needing to still figure out how they're going to not just get into the public cloud, because that's not the end all be all. It's really about being able to get everything that you're doing software defined so that you can put it into an agile iterative process, and then be able to cater to a larger technical audience so that you can start incorporating the security team, that you can start incorporating more of the ops team, not just for software delivery, but for everything that your company does technically, and incorporating automation to do that. And that is paramount to the success of anybody's DevSecOps practice. And then also how you're approaching building automation, leveraging any sort of CI/CD platform to do that. And the real key there is, how do you start incorporating security into the mix? So one of the books out there that I like, the Phoenix Project, and there's now the Unicorn Project. The whole premise of DevOps or DevSecOps is to add security to your overall workflow, and to get the feedback from security to be a part of it. For the longest time, security has been siloed. In most organizations, it's something that's an afterthought. It's not baked in or built into the process. And so and it's not just the security team, really, again, it comes down to having the collaboration amongst all the technical teams internally, because there's been this big issue with some, you know, teams being siloed, but specifically on the security side, where they come in after the fact. And you can look at a lot of the vendors that are out there too. You know, a lot of the products that are created have been, you know, in the security space, have been about being reactive, not proactive, or being built into your automation process. And so, you know, DevSecOps has been around for a while, at least the terminology and the methodology, but the overall ability to incorporate security into the mix, and then also having everybody thinking about the overall security culture of the company and how to build that into the overall feedback loop and the life cycle of any solution that you create is really essential. Now, the key to that is going to be around being able to focus on security and ops. So if you're going to get them enrolled into it, if you look at the base of what a lot of these solutions out there provide, they're all software defined. You know, if it's Terraform, if it's Ansible, if it's a CI/CD pipeline, and security and ops really need a way for them to be able to see things visually. And then the other piece to all this is, how do you enroll stakeholders into the process? So figuring out ways to effectively communicate what you're building, and having security and ops to understand what you're building, and then building that into pipelining. This is all completely foreign to the security and the ops folks across the entire industry. And so the question is, how do we get them enrolled into the process and have them be a part of it, as opposed to us creating the same silo that security has created by saying, hey, we control all of our tools, we're going to do all the stuff from a security standpoint, you go build your stuff, we'll come in afterwards. Well, the same problem exists if you're going to now try to have security shift left and start working more with the DevOps team. The DevOps team is still, for most organizations, it's a bottleneck, because we have a major supply and demand issue, and we can't really expect to just add a security domain to the DevOps engineers, and that all of a sudden we're going to have DevSecOps engineers across the board. We really have to think about this more holistically, and allowing for collaboration between different teams. And then also, how do we cater to those teams that maybe aren't able to only be able to do things from a more of a software defined or code standpoint? They need ways that they currently are used to being able to use products, which is very visual, very much about being in a UI, being in a GUI, being in a, you know, in a wizard, or, creating things from a wizard process. That's how they think about things. And so we really have to think about how we can incorporate these type of people, that technical folks out there, into the mix so that they can be a part of the overall process. So really, when we look at security and ops teams being a part of the process, they need something from a visual standpoint. So whatever you're doing out there to create your CI/CD pipelines, incorporating security so that you can have them focused on, this whole DevSecOps type of approach, and then looking at that from a hybrid standpoint, you also have to think about the hybrid standpoint from the security and the ops team are still responsible for the on-premise hardware. And then they also have to think about how they are going to start being responsible for infrastructure and other systems inside of the public cloud, or is it now something that's going to be handed off in the DevOps team or the cloud team, or however your organization structures things? So how can you keep those other talent be a part of that overall collaborative process, and making sure that you can have them be a part of it in a way that they can consume, which really needs to be from a visual process. So you really have to think about that when you're thinking about building CI/CD pipelines in a hybrid cloud approach, because that's going to be the key in how you're able to incorporate and start getting these teams involved into the process. And there may be some really small subset of folks that can pick it up. They may know, how to code and so on. That's great. But overall, the majority of them are not coders, or not software engineers. And so they need ways for you to help them, which is really approaching things from a visual standpoint. So some of the principles of DevSecOps that when I approach this, I look at, obviously, instead of configuring by hand, everything needs to be automated. So automate, automate, automate. Now, there is a rule of thumb, though, taking and assessing, how many times you're doing something manually, how much time it's going to take to automate it. But overall, usually the decision will be to automate it if it's something that you're doing over and over and over again, and you want to put it into a repeatable process. And then thinking about, if you can create automation around that single task, can that task be chained to other tasks? Because all of a sudden you can create, larger pipelines that will continue to add more and more value as you add more and more to those pipelines. And the second is, instead of manually responding to alerts and events, create automation that helps cut down on overhead and human error. So one of the top things I see out there when I talk to organizations is that human error is one of the top reasons that people look at wanting to use automation and pipelining in general. And also, if you see any articles out there about like cloud misconfiguration and how organizations are doing it themselves, having some sort of auditable process and understanding what you're doing in that process. So again, it's not just about automating, it's also about having a process that you're able to follow, so that you can not only have something that's repeatable, that can cut down on overall labor costs, but also being able to eliminate human error, because it happens in every organization where somebody goes and it makes a change, and all of a sudden they take an entire side of the business down. And so really trying to make sure that you have checks and balances in place, but also just having, if a machine does it and can do it in a repeatable, certified manner, then you're going to cut down on the overall error in that process to almost zero, depending on what you're doing. The third is, instead of being reactive, like I was saying, being proactive and using automation to deliver, software-defined or IT as code solutions in an iterative and an agile process. Because if you can do that and you have a process from the very beginning when you create things, you're going to know not only what you have in that solution for the customer, but or the end, your end user, but also you're going to be able to look at what you need to do to be able to incorporate other solutions, or if there's some security issue that you need to address, whatever it may be. Because once you have the whole view of the configuration of what you've created from a solution standpoint and can see it all from a software defined standpoint, you're really going to be able to be very proactive in your process and really embrace automation being applied to any solution that you're building. And then the last one is, instead of configuring security manually, we enforce security controls programmatically. And really, that's one place that I've seen just a very big issue when it comes to how security controls are enforced. Even back to some of the standards out there have spreadsheets that you can go in and check the boxes on. And so that's obviously not a programmatic process to do things. And so really looking at, hey, if I want to be able to follow some framework or standard, if I want to go through that process, I need to know how I can map that to the security controls. And again, being able to have that a part of the overall pipelining process. So as you're building and iterating on a solution, you should know exactly what your security controls or rules are and how you can go about enforcing them as well, because it's really about being able to quickly make changes and update anything that you're going to have inside of your pipeline. And so if that's from a security control standpoint, and you can do that via an API, you can do that via a script, whatever it may be, that's not only going to be able to allow you to make your changes faster and be able to remedy an incident or whatever the particular security issue is, it's also going to make sure that you understand exactly what you did. So if you need to roll it back and so on. So it's really about being able to know exactly what you have with your security controls at any point in time by being able to enforce them and iterate on them programmatically. So from an IT as code standpoint via DevSecOps, really we're looking at, there's a procurement process at the very beginning. Everything is based upon being subscription to, so it should be as a service. You're going to make, an API request to go do something. Maybe you need to get a license, maybe whatever the process is. But being able to do that programmatically, and then once that makes the request, you can kick off some sort of pipeline to go run a job with existing tools out there. And so it's really about looking at, taking what DevOps has done really well for the last 10 years in software delivery and moving towards everything in the IT stack to automate every solution that you build using open source or open technologies around DevOps and security automation tools. And then also, how do those map to the end products that you and services you're already using? Because when you're creating that solution, everything is going to map to, a cloud provider or some sort of third-party vendor, a cybersecurity vendor, whatever it may be. You're going to have something inside of your process, and so really it's going to be about balancing the open source tools that you use with any commercial products you're going to use, and being able to figure out what makes sense there and how you're going to build out your CI/CD pipeline. So it's really important to think about that and how you're going to balance the open source tools you're using with any of the commercial products and services that you're going to use, but all mapping back to a process to where you can have everything run in a CI/CD pipeline, and then also mapping to, again, the hybrid side of it where, okay, what can I do that's going to help me improve this process? Am I going to move this something as a service or into the public cloud? And then can I apply the same process to something that's on premise or in my own data center? And so you just have to be thinking about those things and how you can apply automation across everything on premise and in the cloud or as a service. So DevSecOps CI/CD pipelining requirements, they have 4 main requirements that I see. So the first one is you actually have to automate. Now, if I'm automating, I also want to think about the integration points between any of the products that I'm going to have in my pipelines, and also how I'm going to incorporate anything that I'm doing in a hybrid approach. It's great to look at cloud native things, but I have organizations where we go in and we talk about, say Kubernetes, and we say, okay, well, you want to do that. Do we want to do this in a way that's tied to that particular cloud provider? Do we want to do it where it's completely decoupled from a cloud provider, so you could run it, on-premise in VMware, or you could run it in any of the cloud providers? What does that look like when it integrates with any of the, security tooling around it? Maybe I want to do, container hardening, whatever that may be. So thinking about the integration points and also where you can decouple any of the pipelining that you create, because it's really essential to think about that. Because, a year down the road, you may say, hey, I want to incorporate this other cloud provider for this particular pipeline I created, or I want to be able to incorporate this particular tool or this particular service. So thinking about everything very modularly is key there from an integration standpoint. Then the third one is agile delivery. So everything needs to be put in, again, into an agile process so that everything becomes iterative and you can increase the agility of every team that is building automation pipelines, which really is about building solutions that you're delivering to your end users or your stakeholders. And the fourth one is really around security, where everything should be baked in from a security standpoint at every single step inside of your pipeline, and thinking about how you're going to start doing security in your pipelining programmatically. And it's probably the hardest thing that you're going to have to figure out in your pipeline, and why it's something that is still kind of in flux on how you're going to add tooling or how you're going to add certain security products from the cloud providers and so on. So really thinking about how you bake security into every step of your pipeline is critical. And then also realizing if you can set the proper security, you can also misconfigure as well. So automation is not the end all be all when it comes to security. You really have to think through how you go and enforce your security rules or controls, but then also how you also are able to roll back. So you need to think about that as well. I've seen it out there in stuff like using the CIS hardened images, where an organization may use those images, and then all of a sudden everything in their application breaks because now they have to go in and look, okay, I got to roll back this particular rule because it's blocking this, or I have to go look at this one. And so you really have to think about, using anything that's even like pre-built for you, like CIS hardened images, still require you to think through how all of the security implications of that particular standard will apply to what you're doing, and what you will have to tweak inside of your process in order to make sure that you have things that can update to make sure your own technology works too, and anything else you're using, applications, infrastructure, so on. So just really think about that and how that needs to be incorporated into your overall CI/CD pipelining process. So that sounds fairly easy, right? Overall, maybe, hypothetically, it's pretty straightforward if you just think about it with those four different areas. Now, let's look at something a little bit. So there's another link inside of the overall chat that you can look at the very top that has a link to this DevSecOps reference architecture built by DJ over at Sonatype. And it's pretty amazing, but at the same time, it really shows how complicated it gets from a standpoint of, you can look at some of these pieces and parts from a DevOps perspective, and now that I'm adding in security into the mix, now I have to think about things and add more complexity and more touch points to everything. Not that security wasn't something that should have been baked into the process already, but thinking about every single touch point on security, third-party risk, compliance, governance, all the things that you're thinking about making sure that are incorporated into the overall pipelining process. And then you're going to have many different pipelines too, and some of those pipelines are going to be able to be looked at from a standpoint of like, where does it apply? What am I trying to accomplish with this? And most organizations that are building pipelines you may have dozens to hundreds of pipelines, depending on what you're trying to do. And if you're doing this more holistically, you should be able to have pipelines built that the security team uses, that the ops team uses, that the devs use, the DevOps team uses. So it's really about figuring out the different pipelines and really the end solution you're trying to create, and how you're going to incorporate different products and services into the pipeline, and how those map back to what you're trying to accomplish as well in that pipeline. Do you have compliance requirements? Do you have certain types of governance you're trying to enforce? Are you trying to make it easier for your SOC team to be able to come in and do things as well? Ad hoc security actions that they can take, stuff like that. So really just trying to think about the different pieces and parts of your overall pipeline, and then again where you can decouple things. So do I use multiple cloud providers? Do I use multiple vaulting solutions? Do I use different DAS or SaaS tools in my process? So thinking about all of those, different teams may use different tools and build different tool chains. So really trying to make sure that you incorporate. I recommend trying to figure out different tools that different teams can use collaboratively, as opposed to each team having different tools themselves. But it's all about making sure you pick the right tools for the team to be able to get the outcomes and build the solutions that they're looking for. And so thinking about that and how you're going to go about accomplishing that is key. And then again, the outcomes of what you're trying to build from a solution standpoint, because some of this could be software delivery. Some of this could be creating, infrastructure for the ops team because they want to like build out some hardened images. This could be security actions because the SOC team wants to go do some things too. And if you just start building out multiple steps and building out these pipelines that can tie into different systems and do different things, you all of a sudden start looking at things from an automation standpoint holistically, where each team can have pipelines, but again, building them towards what their needs are from an automation standpoint, not necessarily just software delivery. And that's where looking at stuff like this, you can start seeing like how you could decouple or pull things out from that standpoint. Looks like I got a question from Dimitri. Securing pipelines is easy when all CI/CD services are consolidated and owned by one team. The question here is how to make sure other teams don't start reinventing the wheel and doing some shadow IT because the standard solution is heavy and doesn't work for them. Yeah, that's a great question. So, my philosophy is you should figure out and find some sort of platform or some of approach that you can have that gives you visibility and having them be a part of the process. I think the reason a lot of teams go and do shadow IT is because they feel frustrated or they want to go do their own thing because they aren't allowed to be a part of the process. And I'm not saying that, whatever you're doing that they need to have the same sort of access or capabilities that you're doing, but really trying to get other teams to be collaborative into the process or give them ways to go do things really goes a long way to solving that overall problem. And again, this is more of the holistic approach where you're looking at like this other team may come to you because they need things specific to software delivery, but they also themselves are trying to do other automation too. So if you can start incorporating the same process that you already do currently for whatever you're doing, say it's software delivery, then being able to leverage that to be able to go do the automation they're looking at is going to be critical to be able to get them to be a part of this. And if they feel like they're a part of it, there's a very low likely, or it's not very likely that they're going to go off and do their own thing. Usually teams do shadow IT when they feel like they have no way to work with you, and so they have to go around you. And so you really have to think about how you can get them a part of your overall process. And it's not easy. It's back to what I was saying earlier. It's a culture or a mindset thing, and trying to get the other teams to realize they can be a part of this process and they can, wherever their skill level is, be able to be incorporated in. And if you can have a way to give them the ability to, even if you build stuff for them and hand it off to them and let them run it, you've already done something that a lot of organizations completely bottleneck. That say the DevOps team to say, nope, you can't have anybody doing anything. You just have to wait for a sprint to get your stuff in. So now if you can start having them be able to, take some of the stuff you create for them and run with it, it would go a long way to at least help with the shadow IT. It may not make it completely go away. So overall, DevSecOps is super complicated, as you can see. If you're trying to do end-to-end delivery of any solutions you're building, and the larger organization, the more complicated it is. So a good reference architecture that I love to utilize, put out there by the DoD, is really kind of showing the structure and the different systems that are out there and how all of these things, well, high level, work together. But at the core of any sort of DevSecOps architecture, leveraging CI/CD and having some sort of hybrid approach to be able to do bare metal or on-premise as well as in the cloud, the DoD looks at it as well as, hey, I want to be able to leverage all kinds of different tools. I want to be able to create just my CI/CD pipelines to be able to go do some stuff. I have a repository of artifacts. I have a repository they call Iron Bank, but of hardened container images that can be used. And then they have a platform one, what's called platform one, but essentially they build a bunch of different things out that they can then provide as a solution with what they're doing backed by Kubernetes. But what is happening is they're trying to accomplish this by being able to focus more in a hybrid approach. They're doing a lot of stuff in the public cloud, but there's still some stuff definitely being done on bare metal. And then being able to figure out the different types of products they're using. So creating everything modular. So really when it comes to creating any of this automation and building any of this stuff out, you really have to think about the future and where you would decouple any of the products you're using. A good example of that is, the different flavors of Kubernetes. They use multiple different flavors. And so thinking about, okay, well, if I'm using it for this purpose, can I use this other one for this purpose? Can I use this other one? And then the same thing with tooling, right? Like, am I going to use CloudFormation? Am I going to use Terraform? Like, what are the tools that I'm using for what I'm trying to build and accomplish? And is it possible for me to remove something from that pipeline and add something else in and still get the same end result? And that's how you have to really be thinking about things when it comes to building things out. And so it's awesome to see, like I said earlier, I'm ex-Air Force, to see the Air Force spearheading the charge here and really looking at trying to get, this iterative DevSecOps process in place, leveraging CI/CD pipelining, and being able to provide solutions as quickly as possible to different units around the DoD. And the nice thing is that they are also putting all this stuff out of there on Repo One. So there's a lot of content out there you can go check out as well to see what's out there. And there's a bunch of, Fortune 50 companies out there that have been, looking at the content and actually, seeing how they can start incorporating into their process too. So it's really nice to see organizations like the DoD putting out content that they're working out there. And then equally, there's a lot of different vendors out there that have content out there as well that you can go look at in their GitHub repos or GitLab repos that you can go take and make your own, but you have some sort of starting point so you don't have to start from scratch. And then you can also kind of figure out what your own architecture is going to be and how you want to create that for your own organization. And, are you going to be doing stuff more in a traditional IT approach, or are you going to be doing things in a, more of a cloud native, or are you going to do a hybrid, which most organizations are doing? Did you have a question, EJ?
I really don't at this time, but so far it's really been good. I'm sorry I got disconnected there because my LAN went out at home. But I appreciate everything, and I agree with it. For the most part, it's what we do at HSBC for the most part.
Oh, awesome! Good to hear. Good to hear. Yeah, I just saw you pop back in and your mic was off, so I didn't know if you had a question. So.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah.
No worries at all. So, from a standpoint of the DoD, it's even complicated for them. Again, holistically, kind of approaching this, getting different teams involved and everybody getting to this future state of, IT as code and being able to build automation pipelining and how you're going about doing that. And so the one thing, if we hone in on what is happening from a DevSecOps reference architecture standpoint and looking at the security from the security standpoint and really why DevSecOps is a thing, security touches everything. It's in every single step in your pipeline, security touches, and a lot of times you just haven't had the proper configuration or the tools being used. And so really thinking about how to incorporate that into the overall pipeline is critical for you to be able to incorporate any products and services you're using. And I'll have to say, a lot of open source tools out there, that are out there to be able to do some of the stuff are amazing, but there is a level of effort required in order for you to not only get them into your pipeline, but also support them as well. So I usually tell every organization, assess what a third-party tool is going to cost you versus an open source. They both have their pros and cons, but really figuring out a mixture that works for you. And I've seen that in every organization I've worked with, is there's always a mixture of open source tools and third-party, paid commercial tools, and figuring out, the benefits of either or, and what's going to and what you're going to be able to get out of those. A good example back to the DoD is, they use a lot of open source tools, but they also use Twistlock for container hardening. So they look at different things and determine which ones make the most sense for them, and then incorporate the commercial ones where they need to, and then use a majority of open source still. So it's and the other piece to all that is just being very cognizant about where you might have some lock-in, but realizing that even if you use an open source tool, there is some sort of lock-in into that tool, even if it's just the amount of time you spent on it and the amount of effort it's going to take for you to incorporate another tool. So always think about that in anything that you're doing, and when you're building any sort of, not just pipelining, but the overall tools you're using, and then what and then what your objective is with those tools, and the level of effort to have them incorporated into your pipeline. And then think about, you don't have to go too deep into this, but think about how you're going to you could incorporate a different tool if you were going to replace that, just to be, have that thought process of, what is the level of effort it may take for me, to be able to incorporate another tool into the process. And then you really can kind of somewhat quantify the overall cost it is to your organization, just as the tool is used currently, and then if, when you may replace it as well. So like I said, security touches everything. It's on every single step of the pipeline. If you're incorporating security into your pipeline, I think that, you really have to be able to incorporate different touch points on everything. And, there's a question here about security is an overloaded term here. It's like saying engineers. In reality, there are different groups within a third party or a security organization. Yeah, absolutely. So again, it's about where the touch points are and what you're doing in there. So like I said earlier, it's not just about software delivery either. So to your point, you may have pen testing, you may have security benchmarks you want to run against things, you may have vulnerability scanning, you may have, there's all kinds of different things in that process. You have different teams doing different things. So you may have a security analyst, you may have a pen tester, you may have, so my philosophy here is just security is a holistic word. I wouldn't consider it a loaded word, but I would think about, every security team has different types of security folks working on that team. And then they also have a ton of different tools inside of their, that their team uses as well. So figuring out where the touch points of those tools are. And then also a lot of security teams aren't doing any automation at all. So think about how they can start taking the same approach that you are to software delivery and applying it to what they're doing in a day-to-day job. So it may just be, hey, I got these 10 tasks in the SOC and I need to automate them, and then the 20 SOC analysts can use it. Or it may be, hey, I really would like to have this compliance pipeline put together so that I could do CIS benchmarks incorporated into it, so I could do my assessment scanning in the process. So just thinking about that and where you're going to incorporate that, and then also thinking about, again, that new type of pipelines that you may not apply to software delivery, but your security team would love to use, even if it's, hey, I want to be able to incorporate using 5 of these different products together, and I want to be able to pass data from one to another, and currently it's just a very arduous process, or we don't even do it at all. So it's really just thinking about how you can have the security team be a part of that, and is there. So another question is there a good threshold saying we have 70% of security coverage in our system? Is there a way to get that kind of metric? Yeah, so it's really going to come down to the different systems that you're utilizing and what you're trying to accomplish in the end. And then are you using any tools that give you some sort of visibility? A good example that I'm bringing up is like doing CIS benchmarks. So if I scan an operating system, I could get a report with a score in it, which is great. But then from there, it's okay, well, what's the score of the application? What's the score of the database setup? What's the score? So you really have to start thinking about, I'm going to say score, but just the coverage that you have as well. And so thinking about how you're going to get visibility in every single part of the pipeline process, and then what are you using from a security tooling standpoint inside of that process, and then figuring out how you would do reporting for yourself at the end of it as well. So is it something where if you have a report, say from a CIS benchmark scanning tool, or if you have a report from a cloud security center type thing like Azure Security Center, if you use Azure, whatever cloud you use, and then figuring out your overall coverage for yourself, deeming what you're going to be able to do. And then a lot of times you also have requirements depending on if your organization has compliance requirements too. So you have to think about that as well. And then is there a framework that you're using overall that you can map all this stuff to? So it goes back to what I said earlier. If you have the visibility and you have the data, then you can create the reports to it. If you're approaching the security piece of it reactively, then you're only going to have the data of whatever you touch at that point in time. So if you can start having visibility sooner in your creation process of anything that you're doing from a pipeline perspective, you have to look at that first, and then you can figure out. And then it's not just about coverage, but coverage is one of the touch points. It's also about the different tools and what you're trying to do inside of your overall process. So from a DevSecOps technology stack, I look at there being kind of 5 layers to that. Infrastructure as code. So I'm sure a lot of us here are using some sort of infrastructure as code, whether it's in the public cloud or leveraging tools around that, like the cloud native templates or Terraform and so on. Configuration management of anything that you create using stuff like, or configuration management tools like Ansible. API integration, so thinking about your integration points between different systems using the API as your integration point. And then also, how can you create your security controls as code? And so a lot of tools out there also look at policy on top of this as well, or in conjunction with it. So you may use something like Terraform, but you also want to enforce policy as well on top of that with, say, like Terraform Enterprise with Sentinel. Or use something like Open Policy Agent, open source policy tool. So just thinking about what you're trying to accomplish from a security standpoint and how you're going to apply any sort of policies that's going to enforce your security controls or rules that you're trying to incorporate. And then the last one is everything needs to be source control. And again, it's not just about software delivery, it's about everything that you do. If you can turn it to become software defined, you should be able to maintain it from source control. And so just think about that for everything that you're doing. And you may already be doing this, but as you're incorporating the security team and the ops team into some of the stuff they're doing, that isn't just for software delivery, then being able to have them a part of the overall process is critical for them to also be leveraging source control. So another question is that kind of challenge managed by different teams, or one team takes care of everything? I'm thinking the security team should be created by different people from different backgrounds, or every team has a security guy who's a guru in that area, the database, networking, hardware, applications, code, quality, and more. What is the approach, or any kind of experience? Yeah, so that's a great question too. So it depends. It depends on if your security team is still a part or is still in charge of everything that you're doing from a security standpoint, and they're just taking over and being a part of the overall, say, pipelining process, just being incorporated into it. It also depends on, what are you trying to retrain people to be a part of the overall, getting more, shifting more left and being able to see if they can actually start, do some of the coding or build stuff on some of these tools as well. So I would say, some people can be retrained, other people, they cannot. So you have to approach things, or they don't have that the aptitude to pick up coding and stuff like that. So thinking about how you can take existing talent and be able to have them a part of the process. I would also say, again, back to my point earlier, if you can approach them and give them something in a format that they can consume, say it's I'm approaching it from a visual standpoint, that's kind of critical to this overall approach to being able to enroll more of the security and the ops folks. So I would look at that too, like any CI/CD platform you pick. Try to pick something that's going to enable them, enable the security and ops folks to get it quicker and not have to take a ton of training. Having a security person on each team, it just really depends on the structure of your organization. So that could work, but in most organizations, I still see security as its own team, and just being a part of the overall collaboration and being just more a part of the pipelining and creating any sort of automation content too they need to on their team, and working with, say, the DevOps team or the dev team as well. So here's another image of, so this is from Level Up, but they're the team working on Platform 1, Cloud 1 that you see here, Repo 1, which is where all of the content is out there, some of it available publicly. But the overall premise of this is that there's multiple different layers that you're able to look at in your overall DevSecOps process, and then also where do you incorporate CI/CD into the process. I see CI/CD as actually covering a little bit more, depending upon what you can cover, even from a platform standpoint. And then you are tying into infrastructure at some capacity from your CI/CD layer. But the DoD is kind of looking at this as a newer approach to be able to provide something that's repeatable and modular. So when they build things up, that somebody can come in and say, hey, yep, I really want this particular solution with these apps and tools. can I get that and have, can I go run with it and deploy it for my unit? So that same process should be applied whether, you work with a bunch of end customers or you have a bunch of internal people or in your organization, different departments, but thinking about things from a repeatable process and also from the different types of solutions you have. And one of the questions, back to the question about managing different teams or having one team take care of it, really everybody should be a part of this process. So there should be one team that always takes charge in the overall pipelining process. And usually that's still going to be the DevOps team, or if you have a DevSecOps team, but really thinking about the other teams being a part, building their own content. Just like if you had, some people, some engineers, software engineers approving, PRs versus, your other engineers that are writing the code and committing their code. You have to think about it as in the same process as you have these other teams out there that can now start building out content. And then you have somebody that's still going to check and, certify and make sure that it's all working and good. So it's all about the end result being repeatable. But if you can have more people a part of the process, you can cut down on that one team being the bottleneck as well, which is always an issue in every organization right now, trying to build out beyond the DevOps practice. And so, and again, the more holistic kind of thought process of if you incorporate all these different teams as everything becomes software defined, then you have the ability to have the different teams working on what they're creating themselves. But at the end of the day, you need stuff from every team to build the overall solution. And so again, it's about thinking about the contribution from each team and how that can be incorporated into more of kind of solution pipelining. And that all goes back to as well the hybrid approach of, is my ops team working on stuff that's on premise? Are they also part of stuff that's in the cloud? Are they using any of the same tools that the DevOps team is? If they're not, why not? Can they be a part of that process? So you have to start just asking questions and seeing if you can start enrolling them. And the good thing is I'm seeing a lot of larger enterprises that are embracing this as well, not just the DoD, where it's like, hey, can we start getting these ops folks and security folks a part of the overall pipelining process and building things that are more software defined or IT as code. So overall, there's many layers of DevSecOps, and really thinking about the overall tooling, but then also what that maps to from a third-party product standpoint, and then how you're going to build the solutions up together. So when we look at kind of tooling, we have to look at different open source tools, and I'm going to start with building my own tool chain. So I'm going to pick, whether I'm using, infrastructure as code with Terraform, or I want to just do some ad hoc scripts, or I'm going to run some more maybe open source security tools like OpenSCAP or Zap. Thinking about where I'm incorporating those into the mix. That also came back to one of the questions that's just asking about, there's different types of security folks. So that's true. And so you have to figure out which tools would make sense for them to build out the pipelines that map to what their job is. And then also, how do those map to different third-party products out there, and start incorporating more third-party cybersecurity vendors and products into the mix as well, because that's kind of essential. And I mentioned this earlier, a lot of these organizations or these cybersecurity companies and just companies in general out there have a lot of automation content out there. So you can go and look at it and utilize it and figure out how you can map from the open source tools that they built content in, and then how that's going to look in a pipeline that you would create. Because that's the essential piece to all this is I need to create a pipeline that's going to go do this. You're going to build this thing or create this thing or do something, right? And then I need to figure out how I can chain pipelines to pipelines, because again, you want everything to be modular. If I can decouple a particular solution and make it, and have it so something I can run with other things, then all of a sudden I have the ability to create a modular approach to my whole pipelining process that maps back to all the tools that all the organizations are using. Because most of the things you'll see out there and say GitHub, like somebody like, we'll say Fortinet out there has out there, they have a bunch of content out there that maps to Terraform and Ansible. So now all of a sudden I could say, I can take Terraform and Ansible, build up a pipeline, and start building thing that's more in the wheelhouse of the security folks or the ops folks that may necessarily be a part of a solution or software delivery pipeline. But I want to go, create a FortiGate inside of a inside one of the cloud providers, right? So I need some infrastructure, I'm gonna need the configuration. Then I want to enroll the ops folks that, we need to be able to update Slack or the ticketing system. So thinking about more of the business process side, but enrolling ops and things that they're going to do as well. And then what does that apply to? Like, I'm not going to deploy just a firewall. I need to have a firewall and so what else am I going to have a part of the overall pipelining process? So I can not only create that solution at that point in time, but then I can also think, oh, I need to add another product or service into that pipeline. Cool. I'll add it in and rerun it and have the ability to incorporate another product or subtract a product too, which is another thing that you may want to do as well. So again, thinking about that. So another question from Keith: do you see DevSecOps pipelines following Conway's law, where the architecture sort of mirrors the organizational structure? And if so, do you address org structure early as you look to transform a development pipeline? That is a great question. So I would say that, again, back to culture and how things are structured as well. It's all about the organization and what how your organization is kind of building things out from a how they're trying to transform themselves to keep their competitive edge, to increase their overall agility. And then from an org standpoint, I think that everybody on the technical side should be a part of the process in some capacity. But having some sort of organizational structure with checks and balance, and also having some leadership that has the vision of what they're trying to accomplish, because you have two different types of people, what I call them, the producers and the consumers. Now, the producers of the content are the people that are creating the stuff in the tools, they're being able to build the pipelines. The consumers may still make little tweaks in the process, they maybe more of the security and the ops folks, but they want to be able to get in and still use the content that you create of part of the process. So that doesn't necessarily answer your organizational structure question, but that does answer kind of the thing around like the architecture of the organization and how you can have different people enrolled. So you may still have a team that builds most of the content, but you could also have another team that would govern them, or however you want to structure things internally. So it really depends on how you want to structure things as an organization, but this all still comes back down to culture. Like, do you have people leading the charge that they want to make these changes? Do you have the ability to incorporate the same process and start getting other teams a part of the process so that they can fall under those that are leading the charge when it comes to all this? And then also back to kind of the legacy stuff too, is it, you have a lot of hybrid stuff. Are you able to incorporate that into your cloud process? I've seen a lot of organizations too, like software companies, that internally they do very little automation, but they build software and they automate to build the software for their customer base. And so, incorporating the same kind of architecture and approach to being able to do things on both internal and external, I've seen be a struggle. But once you can dial that in and figure that out and have that be cohesive, you've really not only solved something for yourself, but you've really kind of mirrored the culture of, hey, I want to make some revenue off of my end customer by selling the software. Well, I should take that same approach to saying, hey, I want to increase the efficiencies internally by being able to increase the agility and the efficiencies of what I'm trying to do internally from an automation standpoint. That usually is more, ops and security focused versus the software delivery side. So, so you saw all those tools, and this is another DoD example, but kind of mapping to the different tools that are out there for testing and for on the security side, and then also on the cloud side. It could be cloud native templates, could be Terraform, mapping to different types of different products, whether it's APM or SIM or so on, and then different types of tools to do configuration management or just configuration in general. But thinking about the different tools and technology you're using, what again incorporates from a third-party stuff, and this is how the DoD is approaching it. So you can think about the same thing from your organization and how you can approach it and what works for you. Try not to get too complicated in what you're doing. If you can find a nice set of tools that can work across different teams, that's essential. And then also, how you can incorporate third-party products into your overall pipelining process. And I would say you probably don't want, multiple CI/CD products out there if one works for you. But if multiple work and you find ways to find value with multiple tools too, don't be scared to embrace that either. Kind of look at, again, the kind of the balance of what works for your organization. So overall, DevSecOps tools are plentiful. There's a ton of them out there. Pick and choose them wisely. Also, figure out what works for your, different teams. Some of you on this call work for, outside companies too, or if it's like the DoD with Platform One, or end customers. And so figure out which tools, that they're using can make sense too. But internally, try to standardize and figure out, what can work across multiple teams as well, because that's really critical when you're approaching, not just selecting the tools, but the different tools that you're going to have to support ongoing as well, with different teams. All right, so an example CI/CD pipeline for DevSecOps is really about, where are you incorporating the security into the mix, but thinking about it from, again, a holistic standpoint that you need to start from source control. You may be building an application. You may be just deploying some infrastructure and applying configuration. So figure out, what exactly that you're storing in source control. The next part is, if I'm going to build it out, I'm going to do testing. If it's a software delivery pipeline, if it's not, you move on to the next step and you just do IAC. So it should be something that should be pretty modular in your approach on how you create your pipelines, depending upon what your end result is. But having the same approach with different tools, so that if you're going to build out your infrastructure, figure out which cloud provider you're going to build it on, what exactly the different services that you're going to build out. Make sure it's something that's going to work for you, that you could use for different types of pipelines too. So I always recommend, if you're going to build out a particular step in your pipeline, build it as if you're going to use that in 10 other pipelines. So that way you have something that's modular and not just tied to that single pipeline. And then the same thing with any other tools that you're building as well. Figure out how that makes sense for you to build that out. So if it's a configuration, maybe using something like Ansible, you want to deploy a configuration or enforce something. Being able to leverage Docker, Kubernetes if you're doing cloud native. If you're not, you take that out of the equation. So just figuring out how and what you're doing from an infrastructure standpoint, how you're deploying your code if you are deploying code. If you're doing something that's more security centric, where you're just deploying some infrastructure and configuring it, look at that as well. And then the end is, is there something I want to do in conjunction with that as well? And in every step of the way too, you could do something as well to incorporate another tool in. So maybe I want to scan my infrastructure as code for any sort of vulnerabilities, or I want to be able to scan my images before I push it out there, or at the very end, I want to be able to, leverage an open source or a paid tool to be able to, scan depending upon which compliance requirements I have. Thinking about things, again, holistically, and where you can incorporate security tools into the mix, so that you have an approach that works for you, and then also how you're going to create different pipelines, and can you apply those to on-premise too. So a good example of that is, I may have a pipeline I create specifically around the Syscat Pro assessor tool, right? I'm going to run that against a particular flavor of Linux. Okay, great. But I want to be able to do that against any system on any cloud or on-premise. So now I think about it more from a hybrid approach, where I'm saying, okay, I've now created a pipeline. It's a security-based pipeline, but I can apply it to other pipelines, maybe from the ops or the DevOps folks that are infrastructure. And so I look at things from that standpoint and say, okay, well, I now have something I could run against, and then fill in the blank. So it could be an on-premise, a VM or container. It could be one in, one of the cloud providers. And so you really, again, going back to thinking about things modularly and how you create individual pipelines that you can chain together and give you the ability to decouple, so if it's a security pipeline, the security team takes control over that. Or if it's an infrastructure pipeline, maybe it's the ops folks or the DevOps folks. Or if it's the code, build and test pipeline, then that's the dev folks. So just thinking about, can you decouple things from a pipeline that they themselves can run on their own, and then those can be joined with other pipelines together. Again, taking a very modular approach to how you're building things. And this is the same approach that I recommend to organizations I work with, and the stuff that you were seeing with, say, the DoD and so on. So it's really, where the future of everything is going. And it sounds like, some of you are already kind of working on this stuff internally where you're at as well, which is awesome. Awesome to hear. So an example DevSecOps pipeline, again, doesn't have to be about software delivery. Could be about, hey, I want to go deploy some infrastructure, apply a configuration, run an assessment, and send a report into Slack. So I have some ops stuff around notifications. I have some more of the the DevOps folks, or even could still be the ops folks around the infrastructure and the configuration of whatever I'm trying to deploy. I may not have a build step in my process because I'm not releasing software, but everything that I'm doing is software defined, and IAC and security related. And then I also could incorporate another pipeline into the mix to do Syscap Pro or some other tool that I could scan. Could be OpenSCAP. I could be using an open source version of the tool. So just thinking about the different tools and what you can do inside of your process. And again, thinking about this more holistically on how you go about building things out there, so that you can build out a pipeline that may not necessarily be required for software delivery, but could be something that the security and ops folks need as well, but in the same process and approach that you're going to take. And then again, mapping back to the hybrid cloud or the hybrid approach, where you're able to say, okay, well, maybe if I'm incorporating AWS infrastructure here, I could decouple that out and I could put VMware in here. And so I could use like vCloud Director or something like that. So thinking about, where you're able to incorporate still something that's software defined, so still something that's IT as code, but I could do it in an on-premise capacity versus a public cloud approach to it. So really just, again, thinking about things modularly, thinking about where you could decouple something and you can incorporate something else in the mix. Could be the same thing with just another cloud provider too, right? So I may want to do AWS instead, as opposed to or Azure as opposed to AWS. So just figuring out what you're going to incorporate in each step of the process. So some examples of CI/CD platforms, the hybrid architecture. So when you think about hybrid too, you have to think about, hey, I pick a CI/CD platform. I have to think about how I'm going to deploy. I have agents that are in the cloud. That's great. I can deploy the stuff in the cloud. I can run in the cloud. But if you want to do hybrid, you have to also think about being able to run that on-premise, and then having the ability to run that against on-premise hardware, on-premise network devices, servers, desktops, so on and so forth, because you may be able to create automation pipelines that you can apply to other hardware or other things you're going to do. And again, in my example of like Fortinet. So if I deploy, say, a FortiGate into Azure, right? So I spin up some infrastructure, I have that set up, but then I have another FortiGate that I need to configure to set that up with, and being able to have that on-premise agent to then run the same or run automation content against that network device on an on-premise standpoint. I've now able to take automation content that I may be able to run against, the cloud instance of it, the on-premise instance of it. Another example would be like CIS benchmarks, where I could run that assessment. Well, whether it's say a RHEL 7 server in the cloud or it's a RHEL 7 server on-premise, I can take that exact same pipeline and run it against that infrastructure on-premise or in the cloud. So really, when it comes down to hybrid, it's also being able to think about how you could reuse or use your pipelines that you create on-premise as well as in the cloud. And again, not just for software delivery, but also for other things that you're trying to accomplish that you may not even have thought about until you're like, oh, okay, well, actually, I created this automation, I built it in this pipeline, I'm already doing this in the cloud, but now I think about how that could apply to my on-premise. And if I have an entry point through, say, an on-premise agent, I have the ability to think about how that would apply to my hybrid type of approach. And vice versa, I may not be all in on the cloud yet, so I build a bunch of automation content and pipelines that I can run on-premise, and then I can think about, oh, okay, well, if I can run it inside the OS, I should be able to do it in the cloud environment. And then thinking about, oh, okay, well, if I'm running this, say, against, like I said earlier, VMware, vCloud Director, but I now want to run, I'm running VMware in AWS, and then thinking about, okay, well, there are things that I could map to the automation content and the pipelines I've created around the stuff that I'm doing on-premise to the cloud as well. So it's really kind of a balance between both sides and being able to create automation content that you can figure out. Some will only run in the cloud, obviously, if it's against cloud providers' services, but some of the stuff that you can run inside of a pipeline, specific to an OS or an application or a database or security tools could be utilized for on-premise as well. So just thinking about how things are structured there and really approaching things. Some good products out there like GitLab, Circle CI, even Azure DevOps, which is Team Foundation server under the hood. You know, it just depends on if you want to be in on a cloud provider's CI/CD product, or you want to use something that's kind of decoupled from any cloud provider out there. But really, it comes down to picking the right CI/CD platform that's going to give you the hybrid approach, because there are a bunch of cloud native, cloud only CI/CD platforms out there as well. So you want to make sure you pick the right one that's going to work for you in a hybrid approach. And then the last thing I'll leave on is you know, there's kind of 4 main points about why hybrid CI/CD pipelines are required, specifically around, or just generally, but also kind of around DevSecOps as well. And so the first one is everything's becoming software defined. So as more and more becomes software defined, you should be able to get into a CI/CD pipeline. So think about that first and foremost. The second one is, even if you're moving to the cloud, you're going to have to think about things from a hybrid approach and how they apply both to the cloud or everything as a service, and also to your more legacy approach to things on site or on the data center. The fourth one, or the third one, is the shift towards everything as a service. So most enterprises and organizations in general are not 100% cloud. So it requires a hybrid approach to be able to still create the automation that can apply both on-premise and in the public cloud, or everything as a service. And then the last one is there's an increase in overall configuration complexity as everything becomes software defined or IT as code. And so getting things into an iterative process where you can build pipelines and have the ability to run and iterate on them is critical to apply that to everything that you're doing in your IT stack. So thinking about, you know, having more visibility in what you're doing, but then also the ability to add in more into your overall process will increase your overall efficiencies and give you the ability to embrace more and more automation and do it holistically across everything that you're creating when it comes to IT as code. So I will now open it up for questions. Comments, concerns? Let's see if we have any other questions. I know I have at least 1 or 2 questions lurking out there. What do we have?
How you doing? This is EJ.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, EJ.
As far as your adaptation that you went through, what were some of the challenges you had for getting the people that you were working with to get, not so much to adapt the process, but to get good with the tool sets and get independent so they weren't asking 1,000,001 questions?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So education. So I push pretty heavily on, you know, hey, look, you have to at least start embracing some of the tools that are out there. You know, if you're looking at doing infrastructure as code, look at, you know, Terraform, look at cloud native templates. If you're needing to like look at integration points or other things you're doing, again, it comes down to like, look at what tools that you need to get into. Can you understand how, you know, YAML works? Can you understand how JSON works? I mean, there are some fundamentals that you have to understand when it comes to this type of stuff. But what you'll find is there's definitely some folks that have the aptitude for it. And so being able to, yeah, somebody recommended setting up dojos too. Yeah, so yeah, essentially working sessions to help people to be able to you know, become more educated about these tools, and then, you know, so practicing on a daily basis, even if you have to start from nothing. Obviously don't apply that to production workloads, but getting in and doing things. This is also a problem that we've been fundamentally solving at Refactor as well, which is the visual piece. So being able to get organization, or being able to get more of a platform play in place where you can cater to this broader audience of security and ops folks, so they can get in and start using things visually. Even if the DevOps team has to build some of that stuff out for them first, if they can get in and start seeing things visually and running things in a more of a CI/CD type of approach, they starting the wheels start turning, and they start to understand like, oh, okay, I can see how I can be a part of this process, as opposed to, you know, just coming from the outside in and having no involvement in the process is very difficult for most folks. So education and getting them a part of the process is critical, but they do need to be practicing on a daily basis with a lot of the tools that I mentioned out there, and just thinking about, how they would, start building solutions themselves too. If you have questions, I'll be on Mike's DevOps Live meetup next week as well. So if you have any questions you have, please come to that, and feel free to ask me anything and everything within reason.
Absolutely. Hey, thanks, Mike. Thanks so much for this. This is really good content. Thanks for all that everyone else that has attended. I'll send a note to the larger community on some of the links that have been posted in here, some of the resources, as well as the YouTube channel where this is going to get posted up to. With that, I really do appreciate everyone that came out and attended this. If you have any additional topics you'd like to see, feel free to reach out. LinkedIn, Twitter, email direct, doesn't really matter. I'll get back with you. And have a great day. And then, Mike, I'm going to reclaim host.
Yep.
Did you stop recording? Nope, not yet.